In this nugget, the rubber meets the road as we walk through the steps to actually implement zones and virtual routers and layer 3 interfaces on the Palo Alto firewall. Let's begin. In the nugget titled Concepts, Zones, Interfaces, and Design, we learned about those basic elements. And in this nugget, based on the implementation of those techniques, we're going to create some zones. We'll configure some interfaces that we'll put into those zones. And we'll also create a virtual router just to demonstrate how that's done. And while we're at it, we can go ahead and put a default route for the data plane as part of that virtual router. And here's our intention. This interface 1/2, we're going to go ahead and give it the IP address of 10.1.1.250, and we're going to put it in a zone called inside. I also color coded the cables. So you see the green cable, think of the green word inside, and that's the zone it's going to belong to. For the interface 1/3 that connects up to our DMZ, we're going to give it the IP address of 10.2.2.250, and we're going to associate it with the zone called DMZ. And then for interface 1/1, we'll go ahead and give it the IP address of 192.168.1.250, and we'll go ahead and associate it with the zone called outside. And as we configure those layer 3 interfaces, if we want to put them into a virtual router that we've also created, as opposed to assigning it to the default virtual router, we can do that as well. The first thing we want to do as we configure these network related elements is go up to the Network tab up near the top right in the Graphical User Interface. Over here on the left hand side, we have a selection of options that we can configure. Let's start by selecting zones on the left hand side, and let's create our 3 zones that we are going to use. Now, depending on the model and the flavor of the firewall that you're working with, there may be some default zones that come with the system. Now, on this particular firewall, there aren't any default zones, and that's okay because we're going to use the 3 zones inside, DMZ, and outside that we are going to create right now. So under Network and on the left selecting Zones, we'll go down here to the bottom and we'll click on Add. And let's give this zone a name. Let's call it Inside. Now, one option of adding interfaces to a zone is that we could do it right here. Now, we're specifying that this zone called Inside is a layer 3 zone, which means that we could only add layer 3 interfaces, and at the moment, all of our interfaces are not configured as layer 3. So we'll address that when we go modify and work with the actual interfaces themselves. For now, we're just going to create this zone called Inside. It's a type layer 3, and we'll click on OK. And we'll repeat that process for the DMZ by clicking on Add in the bottom left here, putting in the name DMZ, clicking on OK. And one more time, we'll click on Add. We'll call the last one Outside and click OK. And now we have 3 zones. Now, these zones all by themselves aren't too impressive or helpful because there's no policy yet associated with these zones and there's no interfaces associated with these zones. But we're going to start changing all of that as we continue to build and configure our firewall and the policies on this firewall. Next, let's take a look at our virtual routers. Now, under the Network tab still, and over here on the left, we're going to go down to Virtual Routers on the left-hand side. So we'll select Virtual Routers. And there's our default virtual router. Now, if we don't want to even have that around or use it, we could select it. And then with it selected, we can go ahead down here and select Delete. And that will delete the virtual router called default. So we'll click on Yes, and that removes it. So if we want to create our own virtual router, we'll go ahead and simply click on Add. And let's give it the name of VR1. In the event that we might have multiple virtual routers, maybe 2 or 3, or you could name them creatively to represent the networks that are going to be contained in this virtual router. And very similar to what we did when we created a zone, we could assign an interface to a zone when we created the zone. Also right here, as we create a virtual router, we also have the opportunity to add interfaces to this virtual router. Also, regarding the properties of this virtual router, this is where we would add static routes, we could configure routing protocols, and anything we configure here would apply to the routing function for this specific virtual router. So at the moment, we're just going to create it so it exists, and we'll click on OK. So up to this point, we've created 3 zones, inside, DMZ, outside, and we've created a virtual router called VR-1. The next step is we're going to go ahead and take a look at our interfaces. So this is under the Network tab. On the left, we selected Interfaces, and then we have 4 subtabs right here. So with the Ethernet subtab selected, it's showing us 9 interfaces. Fast Ethernet 1/1 through 9. Now, here's the dealio. Behind the scenes, this firewall only has 4 data plane interfaces that we could possibly work with. Why is that? It's because in VMware Workstation, when we provisioned this virtual machine, that's acting as the firewall, we only gave it 5 interfaces. One of them, the first one, is being used as the management interface, and the remaining 4 are the first 4 interfaces here. So that's these guys right here. And based on our topology, 1-1 is going to the outside, 1-2 is going to the inside, and 1/3 is connected up to our server on the DMZ. And those also happen to be the names of the zones that we will be adding those interfaces to. So to configure the interfaces, we simply click on the hyperlink. Let's start with Ethernet 1/1. And let's go ahead and assign it as a layer 3 interface. We'll use the drop down and we're going to select layer 3. So now it can be a routed interface with a IP address associated with it. We can give it a comment just to remind us of what this interface does. And then down here, we can assign the interface to the virtual router of our choice. Now at the moment, we only have one virtual router as a choice. So if we use the drop down, we have VR-1, and that's because we deleted the virtual router called default. So VR1 right here is our only choice. So we'll select that. And I should also point out that with this drop down, if we also wanted to create a new virtual router, there's a hyperlink right here that could assist us in creating a new virtual router starting from this point. So with VR1 selected, the next question it's asking us is what security zone do we want to associate Ethernet 1/1 in? So this interface, let's bring our diagram over and take a look. We're talking about this interface right here. That's 1/1, and that's going to be associated with our security zone called outside. So right here in interface configuration is one of the ways that we can associate this interface 1/1 with the zone named outside. So to assign that zone to this interface, we'll use the drop down right here and we'll select our zone called outside. As we work across these tabs in the Ethernet interface configuration, let's go to IPv4, and it's here where we'll assign an IP address. And to assign an IP address, we'll click on Add, and we'll put in the IP address of 192.168.1.250. Again, that's based on our plan /24. So it knows it's a 24-bit mask. And if we were using IPv6, we could click on the IPv6 tab and configure the IPv6 related information. For the moment, I'm not going to use IPv6. We could come back to that and add that if we wanted to. We'll go back to IPv4. Just want to make sure the IP address is there, which it is. And we'll go back to the config tab and verify that it's in the right virtual router and a member of the correct security zone. Looks great. So we'll click on OK. Next, we're going to do similar treatment for Ethernet 1/2 and 1/3. So let's just take a look at where they are. So here's 1/2. It's going to have the IP address of 10.1.1.250 and be a member of the inside zone. And 1/3 is going to have the IP address of 10.2.2.250 and it'll be a member of the DMZ zone. And they'll both be configured as layer 3 interfaces. So we'll click on interface 1/2. We'll specify that the type of interface is going to be a layer 3. For a comment, we'll say goes to internal network. For the virtual router, we'll assign it to VR1, and for the security zone, that is going to be assigned to the inside zone. Then we'll go to IPv4 tab, and we'll configure an IP address. We'll click on Add to add that IP address, and the IP address is going to be 10.1.1.250 with a 24-bit mask. So we'll indicate that with a /24, and then we can click here just to verify that it took, and click on OK. So that's 2 interfaces down, 1 to go. So we'll go to interface 1/3, tell it that it's a layer 3 interface also. Give it a comment. We'll say it goes to DMZ. We'll assign it to the virtual router called VR1. We'll assign it to the security zone called DMZ. Click on the IPv4 tab, click on Add, and give it the IP address of 10.2.2.250 with a 24-bit mask. That looks great, and we'll click on OK. And on this display, if we want to kind of shrink up the columns that could use a little bit shrinking, we can click on this down arrow on a column, say Adjust Columns from that drop down. Again, that was just clicking here on this little drop down and then selecting Adjust Columns, and that should squeeze things in just a little bit. And if it doesn't do it enough, you can actually force it a little bit more. So let's verify our work. So with these 3 interfaces, they're all set up as being deployed as layer 3 interfaces. We've got our IP addresses here. Those look good. They're all assigned to VR-1 as the virtual router, and they're all associated with the appropriate security zone, outside, inside, and DMZ, respectively. That looks great. Now, the question I have for you is this. Why aren't the link state, or why isn't the link state for each of these turning green? It should be green to indicate, yes, it's up and active and ready to go. Why is this configuration, hint, hint, not kicking in? Why is it not working? And I want to give you just a moment to think about what else we need to do to actually make this Palo Alto use these configuration steps, including the zones and the virtual router and the interface configs that we just did.
Hello. 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 Hello.
So if you are thinking, or perhaps even saying it out loud, Keith, we need to commit this in order for the Palo Alto to use this information, you're absolutely correct. So up here in the top right, we have the commit icon, the commit hyperlink. So we need to commit it if we want that information to be used by the firewall. So we'll click on commit. We have a pop-up saying, are you sure you want to do this? We're going to say OK. Now in a moment, it's going to commit that. Now check this out. If we click on close right here, over down here in the bottom right, we can click on tasks, and that will show us the current task that's at hand, as well as previous tasks that have been completed. So just because it's processing and working on a task doesn't mean you have to sit there and actually watch it till it completes. It'll complete on its own, or it'll fail on its own. Either way, we can click on close and just go back to this tasks icon in the bottom right hand corner, this task link, and that will show us the current status of what's happening. So now the question might be, hey, why is this still not active? These links are still grayed out. How come they're not green? And it's very likely we just need to refresh this page. Here's a refresh icon right here in the upper right hand corner, right next to help. So we'll click on refresh and then we'll cross our fingers. So check this out. We now have the outside, the inside, and the DMZ interfaces up and running and active on our Palo Alto firewall. The last thing I want to share with you in this nugget regarding configuration is setting up a default route for the benefit of the data plane. Now the management interface has a default gateway, which is great. But as a system for Virtual Router -1, it does not yet have a default route. To set one up, we're going to go to the Network tab, which we're currently sitting at. Over on the left, we're going to select Virtual Routers. And here it's showing us we have VR1 with these three interfaces associated with it. And over here on the right, we have a link that says More Runtime Stats. And we're going to click on that link called More Runtime Stats. So what this is showing us, these two right here, represent the network and the specific IP address that are associated with Ethernet 1/2. These next two represent the network and IP address specifically for the interface on Ethernet 1/3. And the last one represents the network subnet as well as the specific IP address that's associated with the outside interface of Ethernet 1/1. And if there was a default route in this virtual router called VR-1, we would see it, but there is no default route. So a default route looks something like this, 0000/0. And then for a next hop, we should have something like 192.168.1.1, which is, in my case, the IP address of the default gateway that leads out to the internet. So we can close this for a moment. So if we want to add a static route for VR1, we'd simply go back to VR1 by selecting it. So we're under Network. On the left-hand side, we're selecting Virtual Routers, and then we'll select the virtual router that we want to add the static route to. We'll select it to edit it. And over here on the left, we'll click on Static Routes. And from here, we can click on Add in the bottom left-hand corner to add a static route. And that would include adding a default static route. So we could call this default. This is just the name of the static route. The destination is going to be 0.0.0.0/0, which is the way we represent on a Palo Alto firewall the default route. So in the event that the Palo Alto doesn't have a more specific route in its routing table for VR-1, it'll go ahead as a last-ditch effort and use the default route that we're configuring right here. We're also going to specify the interface. And the interface we want to go ahead and forward out of for our default route is the outside interface, which is Ethernet 1/1. And the next hop is going to be 192.168.1.1, which is the IP address on the router in my real network that leads off to the public internet. And along the path, before those packets do hit the internet, there is indeed another NAT process that's changing any RFC 1918 addresses into globally routable addresses. And that's how that process is actually working behind the scenes once it goes past that edge router. So if all of this looks good, we can go ahead and click on OK. So there's our default route. We'll go ahead and click on OK. So right here in the configuration column, it shows static routes 1. And if we click on more runtime stats over here on the right, you'll notice we still don't have a default route. Why is that? And at this point in the game, we're saying it's very likely we didn't commit it. So even though we configured a default route, it hasn't been committed to memory. It hasn't been actually used yet, and that's why it's not showing up here. So let's go ahead and click on close. We'll click on commit up here in the upper right-hand corner. We'll click on OK to commit that. I'm going to go ahead and click on close, let that finish in the background. Again, if we ever need to check the status of something that's being committed, we can go down here to tasks, and it will show us the status. So that finished just a moment ago. click on Close again, and now we can click on More Runtime Stats over here on the right to take a look at the routing table. And there's our default route right here, which says, go ahead and use this route. If you don't have a better route in your routing table, the next hop is 192.168.1.1, and basically it's that device's problem after that. In the game of IP connectionless forwarding, it's forward the packet to the next device, and then it's up to that next device to continue to process that packet. And we'll click on Close to dismiss this routing table. Now, this is normally the part of the nugget where I do an assessment check, we talk about some questions, and we go through them together, but I'm going to mix it up a little bit this time. I'm asking you as homework to actually practice hands-on with what we discussed in this nugget, which includes in a practice or lab environment, I'd like you to practice creating zones, practice creating at least one virtual router, and then configuring interfaces, and associate those layer 3 type interfaces with a specific virtual router and with a specific security zone. And doing that hands-on practice will be much more of an effective assessment of how you're doing and can you navigate to that location again. Because once you do it 2 or 3 times, you're more likely to be able to do that and demonstrate those skills, whether you're in a lab environment or in a production environment. So it's a win-win situation to do the hands-on practice. Hey, thanks for joining me in this nugget. So have some fun, get that hands-on practice, and I'll see you in the next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.